Hello, I'm Alwynne Gwilt, whiskey journalist, and for this episode of the Instant Whisky Expert Series, we're going to be taking a look at peat. Now, peat, it is a controversial topic because some people love it, some people hate it, some people feel average about it. I love peaty whiskies, but not all the time. I would say I probably drink smoky, peaty whiskies. Maybe 30 to 40% of my whiskeys that I enjoy the most have a little bit of that smokiness to them. But what is peat? What is it? How does it get in there? How do we make the whiskey taste and smell smoky? Well, there is a lot that goes on in the process when it comes to this super important element of whiskey making. So when you look at whiskey, especially in Scotland, where the regulations are very strict from the Scotch Whisky Association, there are no additives you can add into the whiskey when you actually make it. So you're going to have barley, you're going to have water, you're going to have yeast when it comes to making a single malt whiskey. And if you want to make it smoky, you have to use a natural product derived from peat. Now, what is peat? Peat is basically a lot of vegetation that's been slowly compressed in bogs underneath the water for thousands of years. The average amount that a peat bog will actually grow year on year is 1 millimeter. So it's tiny, it's minuscule. If you look at these blocks, that's a lot of years of compression underneath those watery peat bogs. Now, peat can be found, of course, across Scotland, so that's why we use it a lot in the whiskey making process in Scotland. It's also found across Northern Europe, through Siberia, even the west coast of America, into Tasmania. So peat is found in different parts of the world, but in Scotland, it kind of became part of, I guess, the national heritage of whiskey making was this association of Scottish whiskey being smoky. Now, that is a bit of a myth. I have definitely been at distillery tours in Ireland, I shall not name names, where they've said, oh, the main difference between a Scottish whiskey and an Irish whiskey is that Scottish whiskey is all smoky. Not true, my friends. As you will know, if you drink lots of different whiskies, there are whiskies from all parts of Scotland which are not smoky. So definitely not the case that all Scottish whiskey is smoky. But for those that are, such as this Caol that I have in front of me, which comes from the beautiful island of Islay, how does it actually get into the bottle? Well, as I said, that peat is compressed over thousands and thousands and thousands of years. Vegetation that's compressed over thousands of years. And it turns into these big peat deposits. Now, when they actually want to get a hold of that, they will cut the peat out of the ground and lay it out to dry. So it'll be dried into these bricks, basically. For a long time across all of the history of Scotland, this would have been used to actually fuel a fire, so keep you warm in the wintertime. So lots of people, especially people growing up in Scotland, would have had great memories associated with the smell of burning peat when it comes to like heating the homes in the wintertime. So it was used as a resource for that. It was natural, it was free, it was available. Now, when it came to the whiskey making process, it made sense that you needed a fuel source to be able to dry that barley. So in order to help dry the barley, it would be put into what's called a kiln, and a heat source would be applied and the barley would be dried so that then you could utilize that barley down the line for making whiskey. Of course, when peat was a common fuel source, naturally you would burn the peat and it made the whiskey smoky. Today, we get lots of different choices, so we don't just have to rely on peat in order to do that. And in fact, really since the late 1800s, distillers have moved away from always using peat in order to dry the barley. Now, whether that was because the railways came into play, so throughout the lowlands and up into Speyside, you had much more access to coal, and coal burns more efficiently. And nowadays, smokeless coal as well, so that burns, it creates a heat source, and it dries the barley without the addition of smoke. So depending on where you were geographically, you might have seen a shift in terms of the flavor profile of Scotch whiskies. But on top of that, changing palates also determined whether or not distillers would use peat to dry the barley or not. Now, over the kind of 20th century, people shied away and moved away from using peat in the whiskey making process because the consumer didn't like those really heavy, dank, intense, smoky whiskeys for much of the 20th century. As we moved into the 21st century, whiskeys such as this, like the Caol, have grown in popularity. Lafroig, Talisker, Bowmore, things like that. Lots of more people love that style of whiskey making, of whiskey flavor. But there was a long period of time where it wasn't that popular. So distillers pulled back from using it when they dried the barley. They also moved over to commercial maltings. So that means that instead of drying their barley actually at the distillery on what would be called a floor malting, they were sending the barley off to big commercial places where they could decide and give instructions to those people, those commercial maltsters, about exactly the flavor profile they wanted in their barley to be able to make the whiskey down the line. So a few different things happened, whether that was from a historical perspective, a practical perspective, coal a lot less expensive than peat. And now as we move forwards, it will probably start to be more of a conversation around sustainability. How sustainable is it to actually use peat in the process? Because the other great thing about peat bogs is they hold loads of carbon in. They're an excellent source for keeping that carbon in the ground and not in our atmosphere. So there's a lot of debate right now amongst the Scotch whisky industry, amongst distillers, about how they can keep using peat, that really traditional thing that is used in making smoky whiskies, without potentially harming the environment further. So how does it get from this into the bottle? Well, we have this peat, which has been dried. It is then put into a kiln. It is lit on fire. And what you really want in order to get that smoky flavor in the whiskey is you want smoke. So as that peat burns, it allows smoke to drift up off of the peat and infuse in the barley grains. And that is how you get that lovely smoky characteristic. They absolutely get on so well. So the phenols in those lovely oils that are present when you burn the peat, it adheres and sticks to that barley grain, and they become best friends. They just hang out, they stick together. And obviously, as you go through the various distillation processes, whether that is grinding the barley grains down, if it's mashing, fermenting, and especially distillation, you lose more and more of those phenols as you go along. So one key thing is, if you see a distillery saying it has been peated to 50 ppm, so ppm meaning phenolic parts per million. It's a common term you'll hear used in the Scotch whisky industry. If you hear somebody saying that, you always have to question, is that what the level was when they actually got the barley to the distillery, or is that the level that is in the bottle? Because a distillery might request a commercial maltster to give you a ppm level of 55 or 60 in that barley, so that when they get it into the distillery, that's the level of phenols present in the barley grains. But as it goes through those processes, it loses more and more and more. So what you really want to know as a consumer is, what level is it at in the bottle? Because it might have dropped down to 10% of what it was when it initially started. So don't get buoyed away, or thinking that just because it says it has a super high number, that is actually what you're getting in the bottle. It depends on what the process was, how the distiller has actually distilled it, how long it's been in cask for. There's loads of other things that kind of go into how smoky that whiskey finally is. So when you have a smoky whiskey, it's something a little bit different. You'll obviously notice that every distillery out there will have a different flavor profile when it comes to the smoke. And that also comes down to the fact of, where is that peat sourced from? Because peat is a natural resource, and it is the result of vegetation that has been slowly compressed down over thousands of years underneath water. It means that the product of that vegetation will differ depending on where it is across the country. So if you think about peat from, say, Islay or somewhere like that, you're going to have different soil composition than you would up in the Highlands of Scotland. So it also depends, the flavor profile you're going to get in that final whiskey depends on where the peat is sourced from. So basically, not all peaty whiskies are the same. In fact, most peaty whiskies are all different. And it means that if you've tried one peaty whiskey and you don't like that, try another one, because perhaps the flavor profile or the barrel they've used may give you a different experience. Now, there's distilleries outside of Scotland, of course, nowadays that are experimenting with peat. As I mentioned, people like Westland and the west coast of America. They've got a source, they're based in Seattle, they've got sources out there. So there are other countries that are experimenting with local peat, again, giving a different flavor profile. So it's worthwhile checking out peaty whiskies if you've had them before and you haven't liked them. Some distilleries will also, say, take a whiskey and mature it in a barrel that previously held a peated whiskey. Now, that is not going to give you a smoky, intense peaty whiskey, but it might give you a slight hint, just a nod to that smokiness. But generally speaking, when we're talking about peaty whiskey, that is coming directly from the very beginning of the process, right when you dry the barley grains to be used in the process of whiskey making. That's when you need to introduce peat. So super interesting area. Obviously, one to explore, and definitely if you haven't liked a peaty whiskey before, keep giving them a try because you never know. Maybe you'll find one that's just ever so slightly different and it hits the nail on the head. And on that note, I'm raising you a glass. Cheers to smokiness and delightfulness in a whiskey.